Welcome, traveler. Settle into whatever place has brought you here, and allow the noise beyond these words to soften for a while. If these quiet journeys through the worlds of the past bring you some peace, you can leave a like and subscribe to Human and Time. And now, with nothing more required of you, let us go back to a city beside the sea, more than 2,000 years ago. Before Cleopatra was a queen, before Roman armies crossed the eastern Mediterranean in pursuit of her fate, before poets and historians turned her life into stories of beauty, seduction, ambition, and death, there was Alexandria. The city rested between two waters. To the north lay the Mediterranean, broad and restless beneath the changing light. To the south lay Lake Mareotis, connected through waterways to the river system that carried the wealth of Egypt toward the coast. Between them stretched a city conceived on an extraordinary scale: long avenues, colonnades, temples, houses, workshops, warehouses, gardens, and harbors crowded with vessels arriving from distant shores. Far out toward the sea stood the island of Pharos and its great lighthouse, built generations before Cleopatra's birth. In daylight, its pale stone rose above the coast as a landmark for approaching sailors. After darkness came, its beacon marked the entrance to one of the richest ports in the Mediterranean world. A long causeway, the Heptastadion, joined Pharos to the mainland and helped divide Alexandria's waters into its eastern and western harbors. On one side was the great harbor, close to the palaces and the royal fleet. On the other lay the commercial waters of Eunostos, where cargo could arrive from the wider Mediterranean. The city itself had been founded long before Cleopatra's lifetime, after Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE. Alexander would not live to see the city become what it eventually became. After his death, Egypt passed into the hands of Ptolemy, one of his generals, and from him came the dynasty into which Cleopatra would one day be born. For almost 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled an ancient land while remaining deeply connected to the Greek-speaking world from which their dynasty had come. This created a kingdom of overlapping identities. In Alexandria, Greek language and institutions shaped much of public, administrative, and intellectual life. Elsewhere along the Nile, older Egyptian traditions remained deeply rooted in temples, villages, fields, festivals, and local communities. The rulers themselves moved between these worlds. To Greek-speaking subjects and foreign powers, they could appear as Hellenistic monarchs. Within Egyptian temples, they entered a far older language of kingship, depicted in the forms of pharaohs making offerings to gods whose worship had endured for centuries. By the time Cleopatra was born, these layers had rested upon one another for generations. A ship entering Alexandria might carry wine from another Mediterranean coast. A grain vessel leaving the harbor might carry the harvest of Egyptian fields. Greek might be heard beside Egyptian, while merchants and travelers brought still other languages into the streets. The scent of sea water mingled with oil, food, timber, animals, smoke, and the cargoes being moved along the waterfront. And beyond the city, unseen from the harbor, but present in almost everything that sustained it, it flowed the Nile. Its annual rise governed the agricultural rhythm of the kingdom. Water spread across cultivated lands, receded, and left soil from which grain could grow. Crops became harvests, harvests became taxes and stores. Barges carried produce through canals and along the river, and some of that wealth eventually reached Alexandria, where the royal administration watched, counted, recorded, stored, taxed, and traded. A great city beside the Mediterranean was therefore connected to farmers far beyond its walls. Alexandria could look outward toward Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Rome, but much of its strength still came quietly from the river behind it. It was into this complicated world that Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE. We do not know the room in which she first opened her eyes. We cannot know what voices surrounded her, what light entered the space, or what sounds reached the infant from the royal quarter. Her precise birthplace is not recorded, though Alexandria, and probably its royal environment, is the likely setting. Even the identity of her mother remains uncertain. Her father is known Ptolemaic Neos Dionysos, often called Elites. Cleopatra belonged to a family in which kinship and government were inseparable. Brothers could become husbands to sisters. Children could become co-rulers. A palace family was also a political structure, and disputes within it could determine who controlled an entire kingdom. Cleopatra had siblings who would later become part of that struggle: Baroness IV, Arsinoe IV, Ptolemy X3, and Ptolemy XIV among them. But when Cleopatra was a child, none of the later endings could yet be seen. The royal quarter of Alexandria occupied part of the northeastern city near the great harbor. It was not simply a single building that can now be reconstructed room by room. It was a wider royal environment of residences, administrative spaces, gardens, ceremonial areas, and connections to the waterfront. The museum and the great scholarly traditions associated with Alexandria belonged to this same larger royal world. Much of its physical form has been lost or remains uncertain. So we should not imagine Cleopatra walking through a particular corridor or looking from a particular balcony. History has not preserved such moments for us. What it has preserved is the world around them. A royal child here grew within a Greek speaking court connected to one of the great intellectual centers of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. Royal education in such a world could encompass Greek literature, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, political thought, and the skills expected of those who might one day participate in government. We do not possess Cleopatra's childhood lessons. We do, however, know that the adult woman later impressed ancient writers with her ability to communicate across languages. Plutarch, writing long after her death, gave an unusually extensive list of peoples with whom he claimed she could speak without an interpreter. Some of that praise may belong to the literary image of an exceptionally capable monarch rather than to a precise linguistic record. Greek and Egyptian are the safest foundations. Beyond them, the exact extent of her multilingual ability should remain where the evidence leaves it. Impressive in ancient memory, but impossible to measure with certainty. What matters is that Cleopatra would eventually rule a kingdom in which language itself could be a form of distance or connection. The Ptolemies had governed Egypt for generations, yet the dynasty remained culturally distinct from much of the population it ruled. Cleopatra's association with the Egyptian language was therefore meaningful. A queen who could move between the language of the Alexandrian court and that of her Egyptian subjects occupied a different relationship with the kingdom from rulers who remained more distant from its native tongue. Perhaps this is one of the quieter truths of power. A kingdom may look like territory on a map, but to rule it is to live among countless boundaries, between languages, between temples and palaces, between city and countryside, between those who issue orders and those whose hands make those orders possible. Outside Alexandria, another agricultural season came and went. Water rose, fields changed, boats moved along the Nile, in villages built above the reach of ordinary inundation. People continued lives that had little reason to notice the childhood of a royal daughter in the distant capital. Grain was cultivated, canals required attention, temple estates and royal officials existed alongside local communities. Barges carried heavy goods because the river remained the easiest road through much of Egypt. In Alexandria, meanwhile, scribes worked with papyrus, reed pens, and dark ink. Royal administration depended upon writing accounts, petitions, orders, tax records, correspondence. Documents could move outward through a bureaucratic network, while agricultural produce moved in the opposite direction toward storage and trade. Power had its own sounds. Not only trumpets or public ceremonies, but quieter ones, the movement of feet through administrative spaces, the handling of papyrus, voices carrying petitions, goods being counted at a harbor, ropes tightening against the weight of cargo, a stylus or reed pen recording what the kingdom possessed and what it was owed. Cleopatra grew within this machinery, and while she was still young, the machinery began to tremble. Her father's reign was troubled by debt, taxation, unrest, and the growing influence of Rome. Rome was no longer a distant republic at the western edge of Cleopatra's world. By the 1st century BCE, it had become the dominant Mediterranean power. The later Ptolemies survived partly through diplomacy with Roman politicians, loans, payments, and the careful cultivation of Roman support. Ptolemy Exa understood this dependency painfully well. His efforts to secure his throne required enormous financial commitments. Egypt's wealth could buy influence, but influence itself could become another form of debt. The relationship between Alexandria and Rome was therefore already deeply embedded in Cleopatra's childhood, years before Julius Caesar would ever enter her life. In 58 BCE, when Cleopatra was about 11 years old, her father lost control of the capital. Public anger had grown amid taxation and political humiliation, including the Roman annexation of Cyprus. Ptolemy left Egypt and sought support abroad, eventually spending time in Rome. His daughter, Baroness IV, ruled in Alexandria during his absence. We should resist the temptation to turn these years into invented lessons for the young Cleopatra. We do not know what she privately understood, feared, or concluded. We cannot enter her thoughts simply because later events make those thoughts seem convenient. But we can remain in the world she inhabited. A king had left his kingdom. A daughter of the same dynasty now occupied the throne. Roman decisions reached across the Mediterranean and altered life inside the Alexandrian palace, and everyone who belonged to that royal household lived within the consequences. 3 years later, in 55 BCE, Ptolemy returned. He did not return alone. Roman military assistants under Aulus Gabinius helped restore him to power. Baroness IV was executed. The old king once again occupied the throne, but restoration had come at an immense financial cost. Egypt carried heavy obligations to Roman creditors, while the presence of Roman power in dynastic affairs had become impossible to ignore. Cleopatra was around 14. The Mediterranean beyond Alexandria remained bright beneath the same sun. Ships still entered the harbor. Market stalls still opened. Water still moved through the city's cisterns and channels. Priests still performed rituals. Farmers still watched the river. Dynasties could fall and return while ordinary rhythms continued around them. This is one reason ancient cities can feel strangely close when we remain with them long enough. History remembers the restoration of kings because it changed governments. A harbor remembers it only as another season of ships. Years passed. Cleopatra moved toward adulthood while Ptolemy Sellers restored government, tried to survive the debts and pressures surrounding it. The Alexandria of these years was a city of extraordinary contrasts. Along its principal avenues, colonnades and monumental architecture expressed royal ambition. The Canopic Way crossed the city along its great east-west axis. Temples stood within the urban landscape, including the Serapeum, where Greek and Egyptian religious traditions met in the cult of Serapis. Elsewhere were workshops, bakeries, markets, houses, storage areas, and the ordinary spaces required by a crowded port city. Water had to be brought and stored, food had to arrive, oil had to be burned after sunset. A terracotta lamp could turn a dark room into a small island of light, its flame fed by oil and a simple wick. In wealthier surroundings, bronze lamps and more elaborate fixtures could illuminate spaces furnished with couches, tables, textiles, vessels, and the objects of elite Hellenistic life. Yet darkness remained real. Once daylight disappeared, Ancient illumination could never erase the night in the way a modern city does. Light gathered around flames. Beyond them, rooms softened into shadow. Streets became quieter. The sea remained audible where buildings opened toward the waterfront, and the beacon on Pharos continued its work beyond the harbor. The royal household slept somewhere within this city, surrounded by guards, attendants, officials, servants, and all the invisible systems that allowed monarchy to exist from one day to the next. Then, in 51 BCE, Ptolemaic Caesar died. Cleopatra was about 17 or 18 years old. The throne passed to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy Sexti, who was still a child of around 10. Their fathers will establish them as co-rulers, with Roman authority looming behind the arrangement. For Cleopatra, childhood disappears from the historical record almost as quietly as it entered. Now her name begins to belong more clearly to government. The kingdom she inherited was wealthy in resources, but burdened by severe problems. Roman debt remained. Agricultural difficulties and poor Nile floods contributed to shortages. The administration had to protect revenue while maintaining a population dependent upon the river's uncertain generosity. And Cleopatra did not enter this world as a decorative presence. Early evidence from her reign suggests a young monarch attempting to assert her own authority. Coins and official acts reveal a ruler increasingly visible in her own right. The bureaucracy continued beneath her, officials assessing revenues, recording land and goods, collecting taxes, overseeing trade, moving grain and correspondence through a kingdom whose distances were measured as much by river travel as by roads. At the same time, Cleopatra inherited another kind of authority. In the Egyptian religious world, kingship was not merely administration. The monarch belonged within an ancient sacred order. Ptolemaic rulers had long appeared in temple imagery as pharaohs, performing the gestures expected of legitimate Egyptian kings before the gods. Cleopatra would eventually participate deeply in this language of rule. Her image survives at Egyptian temples in traditional pharaonic form, and her royal identity would become closely associated with Isis. But Alexandria itself remained different. Here, Hellenistic monarchy, Greek civic culture, Egyptian religion, international trade, and Roman political pressure existed almost on top of one another. The young queen had to rule between them. Perhaps one morning began with ships approaching Pharos from the open Mediterranean, while another began with grain barges moving toward the city through the inland waterways. Somewhere an official opened a record. Somewhere a priest prepared an offering. Somewhere a merchant waited for goods to clear a harbor checkpoint. Somewhere a farmer looked at water and soil and understood the coming season more intimately than anyone in the palace could. None of these people needed to know one another, yet they belonged to the same kingdom. And increasingly, the decisions made around Cleopatra's throne touched all of them. Her position, however, was not secure. Ptolemaic sky may have been young, but political power gathered around him. Advisors including Pothinus, the military commander Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus formed a powerful court faction. The co-regency began to fracture. Names on documents, royal imagery, court access, military loyalty, small signs of authority mattered, because monarchy depended upon more than a crown. It depended upon who could issue an order and expect obedience. By 49 and 48 BCE, Cleopatra was losing that contest inside Alexandria. The palace environment that had surrounded her since childhood was becoming hostile ground. There is no need to imagine shouting corridors or secret conversations. The historical movement is enough. Cleopatra was pushed from power. She left Alexandria. For perhaps the first time in our journey, the great harbor city recedes behind her. Pharos remains where it has always stood. The Heptastadion still divides the waters. Traders continue unloading cargo. Lamps continue appearing after sunset in streets and houses. The royal administration continues functioning under another balance of power. A monarch can leave a city without taking the city with her. Cleopatra moved eastward into the region of Syria and Palestine and began gathering military support. By late 48 BCE, she had returned toward Egypt with forces of her own, establishing herself near Pelusium on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. She was about 21. Between her and Alexandria stood the forces loyal to her younger brother. The landscape here was far removed from the polished royal spaces of the capital. The eastern delta opened toward marshes, waterways, cultivated land, desert margins, and the routes connecting Egypt to the Levant. Water remained the organizing presence, dividing and connecting the land in ways armies, merchants, and travelers all had to understand. The dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemaic Caesar had become more than a quarrel inside a palace. Two royal camps now faced one another. Yet even here, another struggle was approaching from beyond Egypt. Across the Mediterranean world, Roman leaders were fighting a civil war of their own. Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey at Pharsalus. Pompey, once one of the most powerful men in Rome, fled eastward searching for safety. He chose Egypt. Perhaps because he remembered the relationship between Rome and Cleopatra's father. Perhaps because Egypt still seemed like a place where old obligations might matter. A vessel carried him toward the Egyptian coast. At Pelusium, the court of Ptolemy, Ska considered what his arrival meant. Egypt was already divided between two competing rulers. Now a defeated Roman commander had appeared at precisely the moment when another Roman commander was pursuing him. The decision made by Ptolemy's advisors was brutal. Pompey was killed as he came ashore. Not far away, Cleopatra's own forces remained gathered, waiting for the struggle over Egypt to be resolved. And then another set of sails approached Alexandria. Julius Caesar arrived shortly after Pompey's death. The city that Cleopatra had been forced to leave now received the man who had defeated Pompey. He came with only a limited force, but with the authority and confidence of Rome behind him. He entered a kingdom already divided, burdened by debt, and ruled by siblings whose conflict had reached the edge of war. Alexandria continued to breathe around these arrivals. Water touched the harbor stones. Ropes strained against moored vessels. Papyrus records waited in administrative rooms. Somewhere beyond the city, lamps were being prepared for another darkness. And east of the capital, Cleopatra was still outside the walls, separated from her throne, while the presence of Caesar quietly altered the shape of everything around her. The road back to Alexandria had not yet opened, but the city was no longer the same city she had left. The change first appeared in the movement of people around the royal quarter. Caesar had come to Alexandria expecting to settle more than the fate of Pompey. Ptolemaic had left behind obligations to Rome, and the Roman commander now placed himself between the two young rulers competing for Egypt. Ptolemy and his advisors were already in Alexandria. Cleopatra was not, if she wished to present her claim before Caesar herself. She first had to cross the distance between her camp and a capital controlled by her enemies. How she accomplished this became one of the most enduring stories of her life. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, tells us that Cleopatra approached Alexandria secretly with only one companion, Apollodorus the Sicilian. As darkness came, according to his account, she entered the palace concealed inside a bedding sack that Apollodorus carried to Caesar. Centuries of retelling transformed the bundle into a carpet, creating an image more familiar than the ancient account itself. We cannot know precisely how much of Plutarch's scene survives from reliable memory and how much belongs to the art of a later storyteller. What we can say is quieter and more important. Cleopatra reached Caesar. She had returned to Alexandria, and sometime in the closing months of 48 BCE, the young queen, who had been driven from her capital, stood once more inside the political world from which she had been excluded. She was about 21 years old. Caesar was more than 30 years her senior. Their first encounter has often been covered by everything that later generations wanted Cleopatra to become: irresistible beauty, calculated seduction, sudden romance. The ancient evidence does not allow us to listen to their conversation or know their private reactions. Cleopatra had an immediate political reason to be there. She needed her throne restored. Caesar had reasons of his own for intervening in Egypt and settling the dynastic dispute. For a little while, their interests met beneath the same roof. Outside, Alexandria remained uneasy. The royal quarter touched the great harbor, where ships shifted against their moorings and sailors watched the weather beyond Pharos. Within the palace environment, guards, servants, officials, and messengers moved through a court now occupied not only by rival members of the Ptolemaic family, but by Roman soldiers as well. The balance that had expelled Cleopatra began to change. Caesar attempted to enforce the arrangement left by Ptolemy Xera and restore the joint rule of Cleopatra and Ptolemy Xera. But royal decrees could not dissolve the hostility already gathered around the young king. His advisors had soldiers, influence, and a city whose population did not necessarily welcome Roman interference. Soon the dispute could no longer be contained within palace walls. Achillas brought the royal army toward Alexandria. Caesar's force was comparatively small, and the Roman commander found himself confined within part of a vast city, whose streets, harbor installations, and royal buildings suddenly became pieces of a battlefield. For Cleopatra, the struggle for a throne had become entangled with a Roman civil war that had arrived on Egyptian soil. Yet even during war, a city does not cease to be a city. Bread must still be found. Water must still be carried. Lamps still need oil when daylight fades. Families remain behind walls while soldiers occupy streets beyond them. Harbor workers become witnesses to fleets moving where merchant vessels once passed freely. A familiar corner can become dangerous simply because armed men now stand there. Alexandria's relationship with water became especially important. The great harbor lay beside the royal district, and control of ships could determine whether Caesar remained isolated or retained contact with the sea. Fighting around the waterfront led Caesar's men to burn vessels to prevent their use by the enemy. Ancient accounts later connected this fire with damage to books stored near the harbor, eventually helping create the famous story that Caesar destroyed the Library of Alexandria. The reality is less simple. There was a destructive fire associated with the harbor fighting, and books or stored book collections may have been lost. But the evidence does not support the later image of the entire great library disappearing in a single catastrophic blaze at Caesar's hands. The city survived the flames. So did its scholarly traditions. Smoke would have passed eventually from the harbor air, leaving behind damaged timber, blackened surfaces, and the ordinary work of clearing what conflict had broken. Elsewhere within the struggle, another member of Cleopatra's family entered the contest. Her younger sister Arsinoe IV escaped from the royal area and joined the forces opposing Caesar. For a time, she was proclaimed queen by that faction. Command disputes followed among the Alexandrian forces, and Ganymedes emerged as an important figure beside her. Cleopatra and Arsinoe now stood on opposite sides of the same war. The Ptolemaic family had always bound kinship tightly to kingship. Here the consequences became visible with unusual clarity. Brother opposed sister, sister opposed sister. Each royal name could become a banner around which soldiers and officials gathered. The ancient monarchy of Egypt had become a contest conducted by a Macedonian, Greek dynasty, while Roman troops defended part of Alexandria. Beneath all of it, the water continued moving. At one point, the Alexandrian forces interfered with the water reaching Caesar's position, introducing salt water into the channels that supplied the Roman held area. Wells were dug to reach fresh water beneath the ground. It is an easily overlooked detail beside armies and royal claims, yet perhaps it brings us closer to the physical reality of those weeks. Power could be discussed in terms of kings and generals. Survival still depended upon something clear enough to drink. The fighting continued through the winter. Cleopatra remained with Caesar's side, though the sources tell us far more about military movements than about her daily existence during the siege. We should leave that silence intact. There is no need to imagine private councils or nights of fear that history did not record. Around her, however, the environment is easier to understand. The palace had ceased to be merely a royal residence. Roman soldiers occupied defensive positions. Messages carried news of forces beyond the city. Ships and harbor installations mattered to survival. Food and water required protection. The sounds that normally belonged to administration and ceremony were joined by those of armed men, construction, movement, and conflict. Even so, no battle can remain at its loudest forever. There are pauses between actions. There are hours when a harbor grows dark. There are moments when wind crosses the same water, whether men are fighting beside it or not. And beyond Alexandria, Egypt remained immense. The Nile Valley did not stop producing because the royal family was divided. Villages remained among fields and canals. Priests continued serving temples. Boats carried goods where routes remained open. The rhythms of agriculture moved according to water and season, rather than the ambitions of Alexandria. Perhaps this is why political power can seem both enormous and strangely small when viewed across a whole landscape. A decision in a palace may alter thousands of lives. But wheat still bends in the wind without knowing who wears the crown. Early in 47 BCE, reinforcements reached Caesar. The balance shifted. The final fighting moved away from the confined royal district and toward the Nile Delta. Ptolemy Exarch's forces were defeated. The young king died during the collapse, apparently drowning while attempting to escape across the Nile. He had been perhaps 15 years old. The brother with whom Cleopatra had inherited Egypt was gone. Arsinoe was captured, and Cleopatra, after exile, return, siege, and civil war, remained queen. She now ruled alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. The arrangement preserved the Ptolemaic convention of dynastic co-rule, but Cleopatra's political position had changed profoundly. She was no longer the inexperienced young monarch who had been pushed from Alexandria. She had returned with outside support and survived the destruction of the faction that had removed her. Still, Egypt had not emerged untouched. War had passed through its capital. Roman power had demonstrated that the succession of the Ptolemies could no longer be separated from the wider Mediterranean struggle. Cleopatra had recovered her kingdom, but the kingdom existed in a world increasingly shaped by Rome. Then, for a time, the pace of events softened. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months. Ancient tradition associates this period with a journey by Cleopatra and Caesar along the Nile, sometimes imagined as an elaborate royal voyage deep into Egypt. The evidence is uncertain, and the scale and even the details of such a journey cannot be securely reconstructed. So rather than place them on a magnificent vessel and pretend that we know its route, we can remain with what was certainly there. The river itself. North of Alexandria, waterways connected the capital with the delta. Farther south, the Nile passed cultivated banks, settlements, temple lands, fields of grain, groves, docks, and innumerable boats. It was Egypt's oldest road, carrying people and messages as readily as crops. A royal vessel on these waters belonged to a long tradition. Sails caught the prevailing winds when conditions allowed. Oars and steering equipment guided boats through channels and landings. River travel passed close to human life, farmers beside irrigated fields, fishermen working from small craft, livestock near the banks, temple settlements rising beyond cultivated ground. The kingdom Cleopatra had regained was not Alexandria alone. Its wealth began here in mud, water labor, and harvest. The palace could issue tax demands, merchants could purchase grain, and ships could carry Egyptian produce across the Mediterranean. But all of those systems ultimately depended upon the annual relationship between river and land. A low inundation could become more politically important than a splendid ceremony. A full granary could mean stability. An empty one could become unrest. Cleopatra would spend the years ahead governing within that reality. In 47 BCE, another life entered the royal family. Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, remembered more simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra publicly connected the child with Julius Caesar. Whether Caesar was biologically his father cannot now be established with certainty. Ancient testimony is divided, and Roman politics later made the question far more than a private matter. For Cleopatra, Caesarion would eventually become co-ruler and an essential part of the dynastic future she presented to Egypt. For Rome, his name would one day become dangerous. But those consequences still lay years ahead. Caesar left Egypt in 47 BCE. His own wars had not ended, and the Mediterranean world continued demanding his attention. Cleopatra remained behind with Ptolemy XIV and the infant Caesarion. This period matters precisely because the famous Roman man leaves the scene while Cleopatra does not. The queen remained where kingship had always required someone to remain. Documents still needed authority. Revenue still had to be collected. Temples still maintained relationships with the crown. Foreign merchants still entered Egyptian ports. The Nile still determined the prosperity of the agricultural year. The administration beneath Cleopatra was inherited from generations of Ptolemaic rule. Officials, scribes, tax collectors, financial institutions, royal estates, customs systems, and networks connecting Alexandria with the countryside. We possess only fragments of this enormous bureaucratic world. A papyrus may preserve a tax arrangement. An inscription may preserve a royal title. A coin may preserve the profile the monarchy wished to circulate through thousands of hands. Temple walls may preserve a queen in the visual language of Egyptian kingship. None gives us an ordinary day in Cleopatra's life. Together, they give us something more reliable, the structures within which her days had to occur. Mourning in the royal quarter might bring administrative activity before the Mediterranean heat strengthened. Petitioners and representatives could seek decisions through court officials. Secretaries and scribes handled written business. Orders, once authorized, could be copied and dispatched. Foreign envoys entered a court where diplomacy was inseparable from wealth, and wealth was inseparable from Egypt's agricultural abundance. A ruler did not govern simply by sitting on a throne. Government moved through people. One person carried a document, another counted grain, another collected customs from a merchant, another supervised land, another recorded a debt, and somewhere at the upper end of these chains stood royal authority. Cleopatra's surviving coinage also tells its own quiet story. Her portrait is not the face created centuries later by painters and filmmakers. On coins, she appears in the conventions of Hellenistic royal portraiture, prominent features, hair drawn back, the royal diadem visible. These images were political objects rather than intimate portraits. They traveled where Cleopatra herself never could, passing through markets, ports, military payments, and commercial exchanges. Her appearance fascinated later generations, yet Plutarch himself did not describe beauty as the simple explanation for her influence. He emphasized conversation, voice, presence, and intelligence. Even this testimony comes from a writer far removed from her lifetime, and it should not be turned into a perfect psychological portrait, but it allows the historical Cleopatra to step slightly away from the legend built around her. A ruler could be compelling without becoming a myth of beauty. A voice could matter because it carried thought. A language could matter because it crossed a boundary. And an image stamped into silver could matter because political authority had to be recognized even by people who would never see the queen in person. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra crossed the Mediterranean for Rome. She traveled with Ptolemy XIV and Caesarion and remained there into the final period of Caesar's life. Rome must have offered a striking contrast to Alexandria. There was no Pharos standing over its river, no Mediterranean horizon opening directly beyond the royal quarter. Instead, the Tiber curved through a city dense with temples, public buildings, houses, streets, political meeting places, workshops, and crowds. Cleopatra appears to have stayed in one of Caesar's properties across the Tiber. Again, the private texture of her days is lost. We do not know which conversations filled the residence or what she thought of Rome, but her presence there was noticed. Cicero, who disliked her, left evidence of that hostility in his correspondence. Her position could not be separated from Caesar, Caesarion, and the political questions surrounding Caesar's unprecedented power. A gilded statue of Cleopatra was placed in the temple of Venus Genitrix in Caesar's Forum. The gesture was extraordinary. To Roman eyes, an image of a living foreign queen within a sacred and political setting could carry meanings far beyond decoration. To Cleopatra, whose own monarchy already moved comfortably between royal and divine imagery, the symbolic language may have seemed less unfamiliar. Two worlds were again touching. In Alexandria, rulers could be represented as pharaohs before Egyptian gods. In Rome, Caesar's political ascendancy was reshaping the boundaries between traditional republican honor and forms of personal power that many Romans regarded with suspicion. Cleopatra was present near that transformation. Then, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. The violence occurred in Rome, but its consequences traveled quickly across the Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, the political landscape changed in a single day. The Roman protector and ally who had restored her throne was dead. Caesarion was still a small child. Rome entered another period of uncertainty, and Cleopatra soon returned to Egypt. The sea crossing carried her away from a city turning inward upon its own crisis. Ahead lay Alexandria. The lighthouse would again appear above the coast to ships approaching from the Mediterranean. The harbor would open beyond it. The royal quarter would still occupy its place beside the water. Yet returning home did not mean returning to the world she had left. Soon after, Ptolemy XIV disappeared from the record and died. Later ancient tradition accused Cleopatra of having him poisoned, but direct evidence does not allow us to state that accusation as fact. What we can say securely is that by later in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's young son Caesarion had become her co-ruler. The arrangement transformed the dynasty. Instead of ruling beside a brother, Cleopatra now ruled beside her own child, on official monuments and in royal titulature. Mother and son could be presented within the language of legitimate kingship. In Egyptian religious imagery, this relationship carried powerful possibilities. Cleopatra's association with Isis and Caesarion's place within royal ideology could evoke the sacred pattern of Isis and her son Horus without requiring the Greek-speaking queen to abandon the Hellenistic dimensions of her monarchy. She could inhabit more than one political language at once. In Alexandria, she was a Ptolemaic monarch. In Egyptian temples, she could appear as pharaoh. To Roman observers, she was a foreign queen whose child bore Caesar's name. These identities did not need to cancel one another. They existed together. Like the city itself. Along the great harbor, Greek-speaking officials could work within sight of Egyptian cults. Mediterranean traders could arrive carrying foreign goods, while Nile grain moved toward export. A royal order written in Greek could affect agricultural land far beyond Alexandria. Incense from distant regions could burn before gods worshipped in Egypt for generations. Cleopatra's kingdom was made of crossings, and the years after Caesar's death demanded that she navigate another one. Rome divided again. Caesar's assassins struggled against his supporters. Cassius and Brutus gathered strength in the eastern Mediterranean. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus eventually formed the political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate. Egypt could not simply watch from a distance. Its grain, ships, money, and strategic position made neutrality difficult. Competing Roman factions sought resources. Cleopatra had to preserve her kingdom, while the larger power upon which Ptolemaic survival had increasingly depended fought with itself. These years, from 44 to 41 BCE, are often passed over quickly because neither Caesar nor Antony stands continuously beside Cleopatra. But the absence of those men reveals something important. Cleopatra was still queen. The river still rose or failed to rise sufficiently. Revenue still mattered. Poor inundations and food difficulties affected Egypt during these years. The precise actions Cleopatra personally took in response cannot always be recovered from the surviving evidence, and we should not manufacture royal relief programs where no secure documentation survives. Yet scarcity itself was real. A kingdom famous for grain could still fear hunger. In the countryside, the difference between abundance and hardship could begin with the height of water against a bank. In Alexandria, those distant measurements could eventually become the price of food, the condition of storage, and the mood of a crowded city. Government therefore remained close to nature. The palace could command. The Nile did not. Perhaps the river offered a lesson no monarch needed a philosopher to explain. Power is always surrounded by things it cannot control. By 42 BCE, the Roman struggle had moved toward its decision at Philippi, where the forces of Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Antony emerged with responsibility for much of Rome's eastern sphere. The political geography around Cleopatra changed again. The man who would dominate the next decade of her life was not yet living beside her. He was moving through the eastern provinces, settling accounts, demanding money, rewarding allies, and examining the conduct of rulers who had navigated the recent civil war. Questions arose about Cleopatra's actions during the conflict and the support she had, or had not, provided. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned her to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia. The summons traveled toward Egypt through the same world of letters, messengers, officials, ships, and roads that held the eastern Mediterranean together. Somewhere in Alexandria, an instruction arrived. Beyond the palace, the city continued with its ordinary exchanges. Amphorae changed hands. Harbor crews hauled ropes across timber. Oil burned in lamps as rooms darkened. Water lay almost black beneath vessels moored for the night. Cleopatra was now 28 years old. She had been queen for a decade. She had already lost a throne and recovered it, survived a war inside her capital, become a mother, lived for a time in Rome, watched Caesar's political world collapse after his murder, and governed Egypt through another period of Roman civil conflict. Now another Roman commander required her presence. The journey north would lead away from the Nile Delta, across Mediterranean water toward the coast of Asia Minor and the mouth of the Cydnus River. Preparations for royal travel belonged to the practical world before they belonged to legend. Ships required crews and provisions. Messages moved ahead. Attendants, officials, guards, and goods accompanied a monarch whose arrival itself was an act of diplomacy. And when Cleopatra finally left the harbor, Alexandria did what it had done before. It remained. The lighthouse diminished behind the departing vessels. The line of the coast softened with distance. The city that had formed her, expelled her, received her again, and watched her become queen, continued beside the water, while the Mediterranean opened ahead. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Tarsus, and along the Cydnus, another meeting was waiting to become history. The Mediterranean crossing carried Cleopatra away from the familiar waters of Egypt and toward the southern coast of Asia Minor. Tarsus stood beside the Cydnus River, a city linked to inland routes and maritime trade, warmed by the climate of Cilicia and shaped by the movement of merchants, soldiers, officials, and travelers. It was here, in 41 BCE, that Mark Antony had summoned the Queen of Egypt to answer questions about her conduct during Rome's recent civil conflicts. The summons was political. Antony needed resources for his eastern ambitions. Egypt possessed money, grain, ships, and a strategic position unmatched by many of Rome's client kingdoms. Cleopatra, in turn, needed security for Egypt and recognition of her authority in a Mediterranean world where Roman commanders could determine the survival of monarchs. The meeting has come down to us through one of the most famous descriptions in ancient biography. Plutarch tells of Cleopatra sailing up the Cydnus in extraordinary display, a richly decorated vessel, purple sails, silver oars, musicians, attendants, and the queen herself appearing in the imagery of Aphrodite. The riverbanks, he says, filled with people drawn toward the spectacle. The description was written long after the event and belongs partly to the literary language through which later writers imagined Hellenistic monarchy. But even if every detail cannot be accepted literally, the larger principle is plausible. A royal arrival was itself political communication. Cleopatra did not come to Tarsus as a private woman answering a personal invitation. She came as a sovereign. Court ceremony, wealth, clothing, music, ships, attendants, and carefully arranged appearance could all express power before a word of negotiation had been spoken. The Cydnus carried her toward Antony through a landscape different from the Nile. The banks were narrower. The air belonged to Cilicia rather than Egypt. Behind the river lay the city, and beyond the city stretched the roads connecting Anatolia, Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean. For a ruler whose authority had long depended upon making Egypt appear indispensable, the setting mattered. Antony needed what Egypt could provide. Cleopatra needed what Antony could recognize. Their private conversations are lost. Later generations filled that silence with romance. History offers something more durable. An alliance was formed. Cleopatra left Tarsus with her position strengthened. Antony, meanwhile, gained access to Egyptian wealth and logistical support at a time when he was trying to secure Rome's eastern territories and prepare for campaigns farther beyond them. Their relationship soon became personal as well as political, but neither side ceased to govern because of it. When Antony traveled with Cleopatra to Alexandria and remained there through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, the city received another Roman commander into the same royal world that had once contained Caesar. Yet the circumstances were different. Caesar had arrived during civil war inside Egypt. Antony came after Cleopatra had already established herself as the senior ruler of her kingdom. Alexandria did not need to be introduced to spectacle. The city itself was spectacle enough. Pharos remained above the harbor entrance. The royal quarter stretched near the eastern waters. The canopic way carried movement through the city. Inland, Lake Mareotis connected the capital with agricultural routes and vineyards. Merchant vessels unloaded cargo. Grain moved toward warehouses. Wine traveled in amphorae. Administrative documents passed through hands that would never be remembered by name. Within the palace environment, royal dinners and entertainments belonged to the established language of Hellenistic court life. Later writers emphasized Antony and Cleopatra's banquets, drinking societies, wagers, and extravagance. Plutarch, in particular, preserved stories of theatrical excess, some of them probably shaped for moral effect. One famous tradition tells of a society of companions, sometimes translated as the inimitable livers, associated with feasting and elaborate entertainment. Another story tells of Cleopatra dissolving an enormously valuable pearl in vinegar and drinking it to win a wager. Such stories endured because they satisfied Roman expectations of Eastern luxury. They should not be treated as transparent records of ordinary court life. What is safer to imagine are the physical ingredients: oil lamps burning in bronze or terracotta fixtures, couches arranged for dining, wine poured into vessels, music from flutes and stringed instruments, perfumed oils and incense, servants moving between guests, conversation carried beneath ceilings lit only by flame. Outside, the harbor darkening beyond the palace district. These details belonged to elite Hellenistic life, whether or not a legendary pearl ever disappeared into a cup. And beyond the dining rooms, government continued. Cleopatra remained responsible for a kingdom still recovering from years of strain. Antony's presence did not suspend taxation. Irrigation, trade, correspondence, temple relations, or the flow of petitions. A palace can contain music in one chamber and bureaucracy in another. A queen can appear at a banquet while officials elsewhere calculate revenues. The difference between legend and life often lies in these quieter continuities. During this same period, one of Cleopatra's remaining dynastic rivals disappeared. Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger sister, had been living in sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus after the Alexandrian War. Ancient sources report that Antony ordered her execution, and later tradition connects the decision with Cleopatra's desire to remove a surviving rival claimant. The broad event is well attested. The exact private negotiations behind it are not, so we should allow the political reality to remain sharper than any imagined motive. Arsinoe had once been proclaimed queen by forces fighting against Cleopatra and Caesar. As long as she lived, her name carried political potential. In the dynastic world of the Ptolemies, even exile could be dangerous. By 40 BCE, Cleopatra also gave birth to twins fathered by Antony, a son, Alexander Helios, and a daughter, Cleopatra Selene. Their names themselves carried the language of the sky: Helios, the sun; Selene, the moon. A royal family was forming around Cleopatra that connected Egyptian monarchy with powerful Roman men while remaining rooted in the Ptolemaic tradition of dynastic presentation. But Antony did not remain permanently in Alexandria. The Mediterranean political world was too unstable. He returned westward, where conflict and negotiation among Roman leaders demanded his attention. In 40 BCE, he married Octavia, the sister of Octavian, as part of a political reconciliation. For several years, Antony and Cleopatra were physically apart. Popular retellings often move too quickly through this silence, as though Cleopatra simply waited for the next famous meeting. She did not. Egypt still had a queen. The palace still opened each day into a network of officials and decisions. Scribes still recorded transactions on papyrus. Couriers carried instructions through the Nile Valley. Ships moved between Alexandria and other ports. Markets opened. Temples maintained their ritual calendars. Fields rose and fell with the seasons. The years between 40 and 37 BCE belong as much to Cleopatra's rule as any evening beside Antony. The exact details of her personal schedule remain unknown, but the monarchy itself leaves traces. Royal authority stood above a bureaucracy that managed taxation, land, trade, monopolies, and the movement of goods. Egypt's economy remained deeply tied to agricultural production, while Alexandria transformed that production into revenue and Mediterranean influence. Grain gathered from the countryside did not simply appear in ships. It moved through stages. Fields were cultivated. Harvests were measured. Taxes could be collected in kind. Goods entered granaries. Barges carried them along river and canal. Officials recorded movement. Warehouses received cargo. Ports assessed duties. Then vessels carried produce outward across the sea. Cleopatra's power rested upon this chain. The farther one moved from the royal quarter, the less glamorous it became. Mud beneath bare feet. Wooden boats pressed against riverbanks. Sacks of grain, dust in storage buildings, rope roughened by repeated use. ink drying across a line of papyrus. That, too, was monarchy. The crown was not only gold. It was administration made visible at the top of thousands of ordinary actions. When the Nile rose well, the kingdom breathed more easily. When it failed, politics could tighten around hunger. The surviving evidence does not permit us to assign every act of relief or grain management directly to Cleopatra herself. But the vulnerability of the system was real, and she governed within it. In Alexandria, the sea breeze might soften the heat of summer. In winter, the Mediterranean could turn unsettled, with rain and brief storms disturbing coastal travel. The harbor changed mood with the weather, but remained the same economic heart. At night, the palace district receded into pools of lamplight. Farther away, the lighthouse still answered darkness with flame, and 3 years after Antony left Egypt, the balance shifted once again. In 37 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony met at Antioch. Antioch was one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean world and an important Roman political center in Syria. For Antony, it served as a base from which to organize campaigns and manage Rome's eastern affairs. For Cleopatra, the meeting offered more than reunion. It produced territory. Antony granted Cleopatra control over significant lands and revenues across the eastern Mediterranean. Parts of Phoenicia and Coel, Syria, areas of Cilicia, portions of Judean and Nabatean economic zones, and other holdings tied to trade, timber, agriculture, and regional routes. These grants mattered not because a map became more impressive, but because territory contained resources. Timber could build ships, ports could collect duties, agricultural land could produce revenue, trade routes could channel goods, palm groves and other productive regions could be taxed. A kingdom does not become stronger merely because its border stretches farther. It becomes stronger when that border encloses something useful. Cleopatra's political world was expanding beyond the Nile. At the same time, Antony's ambitions turned eastward toward Parthia. The campaign of 36 BCE was enormous and difficult. Cleopatra's role lay primarily in the resources. Egypt could provide money, supplies, and logistical support. We should not place her beside Antony in battles. She did not fight. Her influence belonged elsewhere. In ports where stores were assembled, in treasuries from which money could be drawn, in administrative decisions that turned Egyptian wealth into military capacity. Antony's Parthian campaign ended badly. Men died far from Alexandria. Supplies were lost. The retreat weakened the prestige that Roman commanders depended upon as carefully as kings depended upon ceremony. Cleopatra met Antony again after the campaign, and their political partnership continued. Around this time, another son was born to them, Ptolemy Philadelphus. The royal family now included Caesarion, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus. Each child possessed value beyond family affection that the sources cannot safely reconstruct. They were pieces of dynastic architecture, titles could be given to them. Territories could be symbolically assigned. Their ancestry connected Egypt to Caesar and Antony. Their names could project futures not yet secured. By 34 BCE, Antony had achieved a military success in Armenia. He returned east with new material for political theater. Alexandria became the setting for one of the most striking ceremonies of Cleopatra's reign, the event later known as the Donations of Alexandria. Ancient sources describe the ceremony as taking place in the gymnasium. Cleopatra and Antony appeared before an assembled audience, seated in positions of extraordinary royal display. Their children were presented alongside them. Territories and titles were distributed in a public vision of Eastern kingship. Caesarion was elevated prominently. Cleopatra was styled as a supreme, queenly figure. The children received kingdoms and regions extending across lands that, in some cases, Antony did not fully control in practice. The ceremony spoke several political languages at once. To an Alexandrian audience, it could evoke the traditions of Hellenistic monarchy, dynastic continuity, royal spectacle, and a future centered not upon Rome, but upon a network of Eastern kingdoms. To Cleopatra, it strengthened the position of her children. To Antony, it allowed the East to be organized through allied monarchies and dynastic legitimacy. To Octavian in Rome, it offered something else entirely: a weapon. The more Antony appeared surrounded by Eastern monarchy, the easier it became for his rival to present him as a Roman who had forgotten Rome. The more Cleopatra appeared as queen over wide territories, the easier it became to transform her from foreign ally into foreign threat. Propaganda depends upon simplification. A complicated political partnership became a story about seduction. Hellenistic royal ceremony became decadence. Territorial administration became the surrender of Roman power to a foreign woman. The fact that Cleopatra was a highly experienced ruler mattered less to Octavian's political message than the image he could construct around her. Rome had used images this way before, and would do so again. A coin could simplify a ruler into a profile. A speech could simplify a war into a defense of civilization. A rumor could simplify a decade of diplomacy into a private weakness. Yet in Alexandria, the world remained layered. The same city that hosted the donations still depended upon grain barges. The same palace that displayed gold and royal clothing still required scribes to record orders. The same queen accused of oriental extravagance still ruled a country in which temples, fields, customs points, canals, and warehouses had to function whether Roman politicians approved of her or not. There is something almost peaceful in this contrast. History becomes loudest around ceremonies. Life remains quiet around systems. A formal audience might last an hour. A canal had to carry water for generations. A royal title might change in a single proclamation. A farmer still watched the same sky. Cleopatra's own public identity during these years continued to move between traditions. On coinage, she appeared within Hellenistic royal conventions. In Egyptian temples, she could be represented in pharaonic form, participating in the sacred visual language of offerings and divine kingship. At Dendera, images of Cleopatra and Caesarion survive within the traditional Egyptian religious framework. These temple walls do not show the woman imagined by Roman satirists. They show monarchy translated into a language older than Rome. A queen stands before gods. A sun appears within dynastic order. The stone itself refuses to hurry, even after empires change. Carved ritual gestures remained fixed. Cleopatra's association with Isis became especially important in this political world. Ancient royal ideology allowed the figure of the queen to be linked with divine forms of motherhood, protection, legitimacy, and kingship. This did not mean Cleopatra ceased to be Greek-speaking or Hellenistic. It meant she could rule through multiple symbolic systems. In one context, in another, Egyptian hieroglyphs, in another, Roman diplomatic language. The ability to move among these worlds may have been one of her greatest political strengths. It also made her easy to misunderstand from the outside. To Roman opponents, multiplicity could be made to look like deception. To Egyptian priests, it could look like legitimacy. To Greek-speaking Alexandrians, it belonged to monarchy. Different audiences saw different queens because Cleopatra deliberately ruled more than one cultural world. Meanwhile, Antony's relationship with Octavian deteriorated. The temporary balance created by agreements in Rome could not last indefinitely. Octavia stood between the two men not only as Antony's wife, but as Octavian's sister. When Antony's political center shifted increasingly toward the east and toward Cleopatra, that family connection became another source of public conflict. By 33 and 32 BCE, the rivalry was hardening into something warlike. Words moved before armies did. Octavian's supporters emphasized Antony's closeness to Cleopatra. Stories of luxury and Eastern influence grew. Cleopatra herself became central to the argument. This was politically useful because declaring a struggle against another Roman leader carried the danger of appearing to renew civil war. A foreign queen offered a different narrative. Rome could be told that the threat came from outside. Cleopatra could be made to carry the weight of a conflict that was also, unmistakably, between Romans. Antony's will became part of this struggle. Octavian obtained it from the custody of the Vestal virgins and made public selected provisions that damaged Antony's standing, including the claim that he wished to be buried in Alexandria. Whether every aspect of the political presentation around the document was fair mattered less than the effect. Alexandria could now be used as a symbol of distance from Rome. A burial wish became evidence. A queen became accusation, and a Mediterranean rivalry moved closer to war. The Senate eventually declared war formally against Cleopatra. This framing mattered. Antony remained at the center of the conflict, but politically, Cleopatra was presented as the enemy monarch. Egypt prepared resources for the coming struggle: money, grain, ships, crews, the wealth generated by years of river, field, tax, harbor, and trade now began moving toward military use. War reveals what an economy has been storing. Bronze and silver become pay. Timber becomes hulls. Grain becomes supply. Harbors become assembly points. A kingdom that had spent generations exchanging goods across the Mediterranean now used those same networks to prepare for confrontation. Cleopatra contributed a substantial fleet and immense financial resources to Antony's coalition. The exact numbers preserved by ancient writers should always be handled carefully, but the scale was significant. This was not symbolic participation. Egypt was deeply committed. By 32 BCE, ships began moving westward and northward from the eastern Mediterranean toward Greece. The distance from Alexandria to the coming theater of war stretched across waters Cleopatra had crossed many times in diplomacy and royal travel. Now those waters carried something heavier: soldiers, weapons, supplies, treasury, expectation. The royal harbor in Alexandria would have known the physical preparation of departure. Ropes drawn tight around cargo, amphorae and sacks loaded into storage spaces, sailcloth folded or raised, timber creaking beneath weight, orders passing between officers and crew, the smell of pitch and salt, bare feet or sandals against deck planks, water dark beneath the hulls. As vessels left the coast, Egypt slowly diminished behind them. Pharaohs remained visible until distance took it. The lighthouse had watched Cleopatra leave before. For Tarsus, for Rome, for the movements of diplomacy. Now she was sailing toward Greece beside a coalition preparing to decide which political order would dominate the Mediterranean. Yet even this departure did not silence Egypt. Behind the fleet, the Nile continued southward beyond Alexandria's reach. Canals still carried water. Temples still opened their doors. Children still slept in houses far from royal politics. Oil lamps still burned down toward their last measure of fuel. The kingdom remained alive even as its queen carried part of its wealth toward war. Ahead, the Greek coastline waited. The Gulf of Ambracia lay beyond the open sea, and near a low promontory called Actium, ships from two competing worlds were beginning to gather on the same water. The waters around Actium did not resemble the sheltered channels of the Nile. Here, the sea opened toward the Ionian coast, shifting with wind, current, and the movement of fleets. The Gulf of Ambracia narrowed the geography around the opposing forces, turning coastline anchorage and access to supplies into matters as important as courage. Antony and Cleopatra had brought together a formidable concentration of ships, soldiers, money, and provisions, but large forces consume as quickly as they impress. Men needed food, horses needed fodder, crews required fresh water. Ships had to be maintained. Disease could travel through a crowded camp without respecting rank. And as the months passed, the coalition gathered around Antony began to suffer under the pressure of blockade, poor supply, illness, and desertion. Agrippa, commanding much of Octavian's naval effort, steadily tightened control over important routes and positions. The strength of Antony and Cleopatra's fleet became harder to convert into freedom of movement. Some Roman allies began to leave. Others questioned strategy. A campaign intended to preserve political power slowly became a struggle over escape, supply, and endurance. Cleopatra remained with the fleet and the resources Egypt had committed to it. Her presence later became one of the easiest elements for Roman propaganda to distort. To Antony's enemies, she could be portrayed as the foreign queen whose influence had weakened a Roman commander. To those looking back after Octavian's victory, defeat itself seemed to prove every accusation made before the battle. But outcomes do not explain intentions. What Cleopatra and Antony understood in the days before Actium cannot be reconstructed completely. What can be seen is their worsening strategic position. By late summer of 31 BCE, remaining where they had become increasingly dangerous. A decision was made to attempt a naval breakout. The exact reasoning behind every movement has been debated ever since. Some ancient accounts described Cleopatra's departure from the battle in language of panic or flight. Some later interpretations have treated it as betrayal. Other modern readings see strong reason to believe that her squadron's movement had been anticipated in advance, perhaps intended to carry the royal treasury and part of the fleet through the enemy line toward Egypt. The surviving evidence does not allow the uncertainty to disappear, so we can remain with what the sea itself would have revealed. On the second day of September 31 BCE, the fleets moved. Antony's ships included large, heavy war vessels built to withstand close engagement. Octavian's forces included smaller and more maneuverable ships under Agrippa's experienced command. The battle developed slowly. This was not an instant collision of every vessel at once, but a shifting encounter across open water, where ships tried to close, turn, ram, board, withdraw, and find space within formations constrained by geography and wind. Oars entered and left the sea in rhythm. Wood struck wood. Orders crossed water in shouted fragments. Sails waited furled until movement required them. Smoke, spray, sweat, pitch, and salt belonged to a world far removed from the quiet palace rooms of Alexandria. Yet even here, the rhythm of the sea remained underneath everything. Waves touched hulls, wind moved across rigging. Sunlight shifted over water where thousands of people were trying to decide the political future of the Mediterranean. At some point in the engagement, Cleopatra's squadron broke through and moved southward toward open sea. Ancient writers later made this moment central to the entire story. Why did she leave? No surviving account can answer with absolute certainty. If the movement was planned, it represented an attempt to preserve sovereign resources and escape a deteriorating position. If circumstances changed during the battle, it may have become a retreat undertaken when victory appeared impossible. What should not be accepted uncritically is the simplest hostile image, that Cleopatra merely panicked and fled because she lacked courage. That story served Octavian too well. Antony followed her. The rest of the coalition could not recover. Ships surrendered. Land forces eventually abandoned resistance. The battle that had begun as a struggle for control of the Roman world became, in memory, the moment when Cleopatra's remaining political future narrowed dramatically. But the Mediterranean was still wide. The vessels that escaped Actium had distance to travel before Egypt. Behind them, the Greek coast receded. Ahead lay the same sea routes Cleopatra had used for diplomacy, travel, trade, and alliance. Only the meaning of the journey had changed. A queen who had sailed north with fleets and resources now returned toward Alexandria carrying defeat. We do not know the silence aboard her vessel. We do not know what she said to Antony. We do not know how many hours she spent looking toward open water. Those private spaces should remain closed. Around them, however, the physical world continued. Crews worked. Sails responded to wind. Food and water had to be rationed. Navigation continued by coastline. Experience, weather, and the knowledge of sailors accustomed to Mediterranean travel. A political catastrophe still depended upon practical seamanship. Egypt eventually appeared again. Perhaps first as a change in water traffic, then as coastline, then the familiar geometry of Alexandria. Pharos returned to sight. The lighthouse that had watched Cleopatra leave for war now received her home. Cities do not know whether a returning ship carries victory or defeat until people begin speaking. The harbor itself only accepts the hull. Ropes are thrown. Wood approaches stone. Feet step back onto land. By late 31 BCE, Cleopatra was again in Alexandria. The war was not yet formally over, and this matters. Actium did not kill the Ptolemaic kingdom in a single afternoon. Months remained. Money remained. Troops remained. Negotiation remained possible. The Eastern Mediterranean still contained rulers who might change allegiance. Octavian had won the decisive advantage, but Egypt still had walls, ships, resources, and a government. Cleopatra began trying to preserve what could still be preserved. The exact sequence of every decision is uncertain, but ancient evidence suggests that she considered multiple possibilities. Diplomatic messages were sent to Octavian. The future of her children mattered. Caesarion's position mattered. Her treasury mattered. And there appears to have been serious thought given to escape through the Red Sea. Later retellings sometimes expanded this into a plan to flee specifically to India. The surviving evidence does not justify such precision. What the ancient sources support more safely is an attempt to create another route beyond Egypt, possibly by moving vessels toward the Red Sea and opening a path away from Octavian's advance. Even at the edge of collapse, geography offered possibilities. The Mediterranean was not the only water connected to Egyptian power. Beyond the eastern desert lay another sea. But plans depend upon more than maps. They depend upon ships reaching water. They depend upon political control of roads. They depend upon neighboring powers remaining friendly. And by this point, Cleopatra's room for maneuver was shrinking. The months after Actium must have felt different throughout Alexandria, even if ordinary life did not cease. The city still needed bread. The harbor still handled cargo. Temples still burned incense. Scribes still filled papyrus with administrative marks. Children still moved through courtyards. Merchants still argued over price. But political uncertainty now surrounded every ordinary sound. War often enters cities this way before soldiers arrive, not first as battle, but as rumor, as changes in prices, as delayed ships, as new military orders, as guarded warehouses, as messengers arriving more frequently, as people beginning to wonder whether the authority above them will still exist when the season changes. Cleopatra's court would have known that Octavian was coming. His victory at Actium had removed the greatest military obstacle before him. Through the winter and into 30 BCE, the distance between victor and defeated kingdom narrowed. Antony remained in Egypt. His political power outside it had largely collapsed. Allies deserted. Regional rulers changed sides. The network that once extended through the eastern Mediterranean began to dissolve. A kingdom that had only years earlier projected titles and dynastic claims across broad territories now contracted back toward its center. Alexandria, the same city where Cleopatra had been born, the same city from which she had once been expelled, the same city where Caesar had restored her, the same city where Antony had spent winters beneath the lights of the palace. History often returns to places without returning them to what they were. The royal quarter remained physically familiar. Stone, guarder, administrative rooms, harbor views. But the meanings accumulated there had become heavier. Cleopatra was now nearly 40. More than half her life had been spent as queen. She had ruled through civil war, famine conditions, Roman intervention, dynastic conflict, alliance, expansion, and defeat. Octavian's advance reduced all of that experience to one immediate question. What could still be saved? Perhaps Egypt itself could not remain independent. Perhaps Cleopatra could bargain for the future of her children. Perhaps Caesarion might be preserved. Perhaps the treasury could become leverage. Perhaps surrender could delay humiliation. Ancient sources preserve negotiations, but not the full interior logic behind them. So the queen's motives should remain expressed through actions rather than imagined thoughts. She sent messages. She bargained. She prepared. And she built or completed the royal mausoleum that would become central to the final weeks of her life. The structure is known through literary accounts rather than surviving archaeology. Its exact location has not been securely identified. Ancient descriptions suggest a monumental royal building in which Cleopatra gathered valuable possessions and later withdrew as Octavian closed upon the city. The mausoleum carried more than funerary meaning. It contained wealth. It could become refuge. It could become bargaining power. And eventually it would become the place where the last scenes of Cleopatra and Antony's shared story were remembered. Beyond Alexandria, Octavian advanced through Egypt's approaches. Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the delta, fell with relatively little resistance. Ancient writers sometimes attach accusations of betrayal to this surrender, as victorious histories often do, when an enemy position collapses quickly. The evidence does not allow every such accusation to be accepted. What matters is that the road toward Alexandria opened. The geography that had once protected Egypt now offered no permanent barrier. Waterways, forts, and desert approaches could delay an invading army. They could not reverse Actium. By the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces reached Alexandria. The city that had once trapped Caesar now received another Roman army. But this time, the Roman commander arrived from a position of overwhelming advantage. There was still resistance. Antony's remaining forces fought outside the city. Ancient accounts describe an initial cavalry success followed by collapse as men and units deserted. A fleet attempted movement and surrendered. The remaining military structure around Antony dissolved. Alexandria did not need a great siege to understand that the political order was ending. A city can know defeat before its walls are broken. Stand in imagination somewhere away from the fighting, not in the palace, not among soldiers. Perhaps beside a narrow street where a small lamp burns inside a doorway. The summer air remains warm. A dog barks farther away. Somewhere a vessel knocks softly against a quay. People speak quietly because armies are near. A pot is moved from a fire. A child is told to remain indoors. The end of a dynasty does not occur only in throne rooms. It passes through kitchens and courtyards. It alters how long people stand outside after dark. It changes which uniforms appear at intersections. It changes the sound of footsteps. On the final day of Antony's military resistance, confusion entered the royal world. Cleopatra withdrew into the mausoleum with attendants and had its entrance secured. Why she did this, and exactly what messages passed between her and Antony, survive through later literary narration. Plutarch tells us that a false report reached Antony that Cleopatra had died. Believing the report, Antony attempted to kill himself with his sword. The wound did not immediately end his life. Then came word that Cleopatra was alive. The story that follows is one of the most dramatic scenes in Plutarch's account. Antony, mortally wounded, was carried toward Cleopatra's mausoleum. The doors were closed. He was raised by ropes through an upper opening, while Cleopatra and her attendants pulled him inside. It is an unforgettable image. It may also have been shaped by the tragic literary traditions through which later writers understood Antony's death. The physical event is plausible. The precise words and emotions preserved around it should be treated with more caution. What is safe is that Antony died shortly after his final military defeat, with Cleopatra still alive inside the royal complex or mausoleum. The man who had once controlled Rome's eastern world was gone. Outside, Octavian's victory had become nearly complete. The political alliance that had reshaped the eastern Mediterranean had contracted to a room, a monument, and a dying man. Yet Cleopatra remained queen for a little longer. This small interval matters, because after Antony's death, her story did not immediately become the story of suicide. It became, for several days, a story of negotiation. Octavian needed Cleopatra alive, at least temporarily. He needed the royal treasury secured. He needed Egypt under control. He needed the transition of power to occur without unnecessary destruction. Cleopatra still possessed information, wealth, symbolic authority, and children whose futures could complicate Roman politics. And Caesarion existed. The boy had grown into a teenager under the shadow of a claim that could never become politically innocent. If Julius Caesar was accepted as his father, then Caesarion carried a name and lineage Octavian could not comfortably ignore. Octavian himself had built much of his political legitimacy through adoption as Caesar's heir. Two Caesars could not easily share the same future. Cleopatra appears to have tried to secure her son's safety. Ancient accounts suggest that Caesarion was sent away from Alexandria, perhaps toward Upper Egypt or farther south, in an effort to remove him from Octavian's reach. His movements would later become part of the final dismantling of the dynasty. For the moment, however, Cleopatra remained under guard. Octavian's officer, Proculius, gained access to the mausoleum. Plutarch describes the capture dramatically, with Roman men entering through an opening while Cleopatra tried to prevent them. Again, the details come through a later literary source, but the central result is clear. Cleopatra lost control of the place in which she had enclosed herself. She was now effectively Octavian's prisoner. The change was profound. For almost 2 decades, Cleopatra had issued commands across Egypt. Now guards controlled her movement. The difference between sovereign and captive can be measured in something as simple as a door. Once, others waited to be admitted to her presence. Now others decided whether she could leave a room. And still, negotiations continued. Octavian met with Cleopatra. Ancient writers tried to reconstruct the encounter through speeches, gestures, tears, persuasion, calculation. We cannot know those details securely. What can be understood is the imbalance. Octavian had won. Cleopatra had little military leverage remaining. Her remaining concerns centered on survival, dignity, wealth, and the future of her children. Octavian's concerns included control of Egypt and the political value of his victory. One tradition holds that Cleopatra came to understand that he intended to take her to Rome and display her in a triumph. This would have followed established Roman practice toward defeated rulers, but the exact certainty of Octavian's intention is difficult to prove. For Cleopatra, however, the possibility alone may have mattered. She had already lived in Rome. She knew what a triumph meant. A captive ruler could be made into evidence of another man's greatness. Chains could transform monarchy into spectacle. Her image could be carried through streets where she had once lived as Caesar's guest. Whether Octavian explicitly told her this, or whether she inferred it from Roman custom, ancient accounts place the fear of public humiliation close to the final decision. The days narrowed. Outside her guarded quarters, Alexandria was entering another form of occupation. Roman soldiers controlled the city. The royal administration did not disappear overnight. Conquerors need systems to continue functioning. Taxes still needed collecting. Grain still needed moving. Warehouses still contained goods. The Nile had not changed direction because Octavian had arrived. Political regimes survive partly by taking possession of structures built by those they defeat. Egypt's bureaucracy would outlive Cleopatra. Its fields would outlive her. Its temples would continue. Its grain would soon feed an imperial system governed from Rome. The queen could probably sense the scale of what had been lost without the documentary placing words inside her mind. Everything around her made it visible. Roman guards, Roman orders, Roman control of the treasury, Roman decisions concerning her children. The royal palace was still physically there, but the monarchy had begun to vanish from inside it. Ancient tradition says Cleopatra was permitted to visit Antony's tomb. Whether every detail of that visit can be accepted is uncertain, but it belongs to the surviving narrative of her final days. Afterward, she returned to confinement. She bathed. She ate. Messages passed. Iris and Charmian, two women closely associated with her household, remained with her. The final method by which Cleopatra died has never been proven. The most famous version brings an asp, usually imagined as an Egyptian cobra, concealed in a basket. Other ancient accounts leave room for a poisoned instrument. Some modern interpretations have proposed an ingested mixture of toxic substances. The medical practicality of arranging death by cobra for multiple people has raised serious doubts about the traditional scene, but ancient writers themselves were not fully certain. That uncertainty is worth preserving. For centuries, the snake became so powerful an image that it almost replaced the historical woman. A queen, a basket, a serpent, a final act. Simple images survive because they are easy to remember. Real history is often less cooperative. It leaves several possibilities, a few witnesses, later writers, political propaganda, and a room whose contents cannot be recovered. So we should not enter that room too quickly. Cleopatra was still alive. Outside, August heat rested over Alexandria. The harbor received sunlight. Pharos stood above the water. Lake Mareotis remained behind the city. The Nile continued moving far beyond the walls. Roman soldiers occupied streets where Greek and Egyptian voices had mixed for generations. The Ptolemaic kingdom still existed in name for a little while longer. concentrated now around a woman under guard and a sun moving somewhere beyond the capital. Oil lamps would soon be lit again as daylight softened. The palace had not yet fallen completely silent, and somewhere within its guarded spaces, Cleopatra was preparing for the last decision that Rome would not be allowed to make for her. There was no spectacle at first, no procession, no crowd, no trumpet announcing that a dynasty had reached its final hours. Only guarded rooms inside a city already controlled by another power. Cleopatra remained under watch, while Octavian secured Alexandria around her. The streets beyond the palace still carried the sounds of occupation and ordinary life together. Roman orders spoken beside market voices, sandals moving across stone, carts passing through streets that had known Ptolemaic rulers for almost 3 centuries. The monarchy had become fragile enough to exist almost entirely in memory. A seal, a title, a royal name on papyrus, a carved figure on a temple wall, and a queen who was no longer free to command the doors around her. Ancient writers place her death in August of 30 BCE. She was 39 years old. What happened inside the final room has never been recovered with certainty. Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and other ancient authors preserve versions of the famous story. An asp brought secretly into Cleopatra's quarters, perhaps hidden among figs, perhaps delivered by another means. Other traditions imagined a poisoned instrument. Modern interpretations have suggested that a prepared toxic mixture may have been more practical than relying upon the unpredictable bite of a cobra. No explanation can now be proven. Even the ancient accounts preserve uncertainty. The snake became the image that survived because it belonged so naturally to the way later generations wanted to remember Egypt. A queen, a cobra, a death chosen rather than imposed. But history is under no obligation to preserve symbols as facts. So we can leave the basket closed. We can leave the serpent where the evidence leaves it, somewhere between possibility, tradition, and legend. What is much safer is the outcome. Cleopatra died. Iris and Charmian, the 2 attendants remembered beside her in the final ancient accounts, died with her or near her. When Octavian's men entered, the Queen of Egypt was beyond their control, in the one way still available to her. The precise arrangement of the room is lost. The last words are lost. The exact method is lost. Silence has protected them more completely than stone ever could. Outside, Alexandria remained awake. The Mediterranean light still reached the palace district. Ships still rested in the harbor. The lighthouse on Pharos continued to guide vessels toward the coast. Merchants still needed to know where cargo would be unloaded. Fishermen still needed to know the condition of the sea. None of those tasks waited for Rome to decide how Cleopatra would be remembered. Octavian had won Egypt, but first there remained the matter of its royal family. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son and co-ruler, had been sent away from Alexandria during the collapse of the kingdom. Ancient accounts suggest that he traveled southward, perhaps toward Upper Egypt, with the hope of escaping Octavian's reach. For a short time, he remained alive beyond the city. He was about 17. His name was Ptolemy XV Caesar, but the name by which history remembers him makes the political danger easier to understand. Caesarion, Little Caesar. To Cleopatra, he had been the future of the Ptolemaic throne. To Octavian, whose own authority rested heavily upon being Julius Caesar's adopted heir, the existence of another young man publicly presented as Caesar's son created a dangerous ambiguity. Caesarion was persuaded or brought back. Octavian had him killed. Ancient tradition later condensed the decision into a bitter phrase about there being no good in too many Caesars. Whether those exact words were spoken matters less than the political logic behind them. The young co-ruler disappeared. With him disappeared the direct continuation Cleopatra had tried to establish through her eldest son. The twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus were spared. They would eventually be taken to Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ended in Egypt, but fragments of Cleopatra's family would continue elsewhere. Cleopatra Selene would survive into adulthood and later become Queen of Mauritania beside Juba. Through her, something of the Alexandrian court would travel westward into another kingdom. Dynasties rarely disappear as cleanly as political histories suggest. Bloodlines cross borders, names survive, objects are carried away, memories find new landscapes. Even after a capital falls, parts of it remain alive in places far beyond its walls. In Alexandria, however, there would be no new Ptolemaic monarch. Octavian annexed Egypt into the Roman world. The kingdom became a possession governed under Roman authority. Its extraordinary wealth made it too important to leave in uncertain hands. The same grain fields that had sustained the Ptolemies would now serve a different political system. The same river barges would continue moving. The same granaries would still fill and empty. The same officials, or men performing much the same tasks, would continue measuring, recording, storing, taxing, and dispatching. Rome changed the ownership of the state. It did not need to reinvent the Nile, and perhaps nowhere is the difference between political history and human life clearer than here. On one day, Cleopatra is queen. On another, she is dead. A dynasty lasting almost 300 years has ended. Yet somewhere upriver, a farmer still waits for water. A boatman still pushes away from a muddy bank. A priest still approaches a temple doorway. A child still reaches for bread. An old woman still sits in the shade of a wall. A worker still ties rope around cargo. History has changed everything, and the world appears, for a moment, almost unchanged. That is how time often moves, not as a door slamming shut, but as one set of names slowly disappearing while the sounds underneath them remain. Octavian would eventually become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. His victory over Antony and Cleopatra became one of the foundations of a new political age. Rome would describe the war in ways that served that new order. Cleopatra, especially, would become useful as an image, the dangerous foreign queen, the luxurious Eastern monarch, the woman whose influence had supposedly corrupted Antony, the enemy whose defeat made Roman victory appear not merely political, but moral. These ideas survived because the victors possessed the stronger machinery of memory. Poets wrote, historians interpreted, monuments celebrated, coins circulated. The defeated queen could no longer answer any of them. Her voice survived only indirectly through the decisions, representations, inscriptions, coins, and scattered documents that remained after her. This is why we must be careful when looking backward. The Cleopatra of Roman propaganda is not the whole woman. The Cleopatra of later romance is not the whole woman. The Cleopatra of paintings, plays, novels, and films is not the whole woman. Even the Cleopatra, reconstructed by modern historians, remains incomplete. The past rarely gives us complete people. It gives us fragments. A face stamped in metal, a name carved beside a god, a tax document, a political enemy's complaint, a later biographer's admiration, a rumor, a battlefield, a ruined harbor beneath modern water. From such pieces, an entire life must be approached with humility. Her appearance provides a simple example. Ancient coins show Cleopatra with strong and distinctive features, rendered in Hellenistic royal style. Later centuries transformed her into whatever beauty their own age preferred. Plutarch, however, remembered something more subtle. He did not make extraordinary physical beauty the central explanation for her power. He wrote instead of voice, conversation, intelligence, and presence. Even if we treat his testimony cautiously, it reminds us that influence is not easily captured in marble or silver. A coin can preserve the shape of a nose. It cannot preserve the way someone listened. A statue can preserve a posture. It cannot preserve the pace of speech. An inscription can preserve a title. It cannot preserve hesitation. History keeps what objects can hold. People were always more than their objects. Cleopatra's political skill, too, becomes clearer when separated from the legends surrounding her relationships. She was not simply a woman who happened to stand beside Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She had become queen before either relationship defined her reign. She lost power and recovered it. She governed during years when neither man was present. She negotiated with Roman factions that could easily have destroyed her kingdom. She used Greek and Egyptian forms of royal legitimacy. She represented herself in temple reliefs as a pharaoh while appearing on coinage within Hellenistic traditions. She connected her monarchy with Isis. She raised Caesarion as co-ruler. She maintained Egypt's position for years inside a Mediterranean increasingly dominated by Rome. None of this requires us to imagine perfection. Cleopatra could be ruthless. Ptolemaic dynastic politics had always been ruthless. Her siblings became rivals. Some died, some disappeared. Political survival in her family was rarely gentle. nor should we turn her into a modern ruler with modern values. She belonged entirely to her own age. The world she understood was one in which monarchy could be sacred, siblings could share thrones, royal families could marry within themselves, rulers could order executions, temples could hold vast economic power, and empires could treat entire kingdoms as pieces of negotiation. To make Cleopatra human is not to make her modern. It is to allow her to remain complicated, a ruler, a mother, a political survivor, a monarch shaped by Greek traditions ruling an ancient Egyptian kingdom, a woman who spoke to Rome when Rome was becoming impossible to ignore, a person remembered through the writings of men who often had reasons to distrust, admire, condemn, or romanticize her. After her death, Octavian allowed Cleopatra and Antony to be buried together according to ancient accounts. The exact location of their tomb remains unknown. Alexandria has changed too much for certainty. Parts of the ancient royal quarter now lie beneath later construction or beneath the sea. Earthquakes altered the coastline. Buildings fell. Stones were reused. Water-covered places where palaces once faced the harbor. Somewhere in that vanished landscape, Cleopatra was laid to rest. We do not need to find the tomb to remain with the thought of it. A royal burial in a city changing rulers, perhaps incense, perhaps stone, perhaps people moving quietly through a final ritual. But here, too, the evidence thins, and the most respectful thing is not to decorate the silence. A body disappears. A monument disappears. The city remains. Alexandria under Roman rule did not become empty. Ships still came from across the Mediterranean. The scholarly traditions associated with the city continued. Temples remained active. The harbor still connected Egypt with the wider world. Greek remained widely spoken. Egyptian religious life continued. Roman officials took possession of administrative systems built through centuries of earlier rule. What changed was the direction of sovereignty. Orders no longer ended with a Ptolemy. Egypt's wealth now flowed into an imperial structure centered elsewhere. Grain would become especially important. Ships loaded in Alexandria sailed toward Rome, carrying food produced by the Nile Valley. To someone working at the docks, the sacks may have looked much the same. The empire receiving them had changed. This quiet continuity is perhaps the most powerful way to leave Cleopatra behind. Not at the moment of death. Not with the snake. Not with Antony. Not even with Octavian. But with the ordinary mechanisms of the world continuing without her. Walk away from the royal quarter for a while. Let the palace grow distant behind us. Move through Alexandria towards streets where fewer royal monuments dominate the view. The city has entered Roman rule, but the paving remains beneath your feet. A doorway opens. Someone carries water. Smoke rises from food being prepared. The smell of fish reaches the street from somewhere closer to the harbor. Voices overlap. Greek, Egyptian, perhaps Latin among Roman soldiers and officials. Languages Cleopatra herself once navigated now continue without needing her. Farther toward the waterfront, ropes lie coiled beside cargo. Wooden hulls rise and fall gently. The sea wind moves through rigging. Tar and salt cling to the air. A gull circles above the water. A porter bends beneath a load. A clerk records something that matters to trade and will never matter to history. This is the city Cleopatra knew more deeply than any battlefield. Not the Alexandria of monuments alone, the Alexandria of work. Near the inland waters, goods continue arriving from the Nile system. Imagine following them backward, away from the coast, across Lake Mareotis, along canals, into the delta, then farther south. The city loosens around us until fields replace colonnades. The air changes. The sea is gone. The river remains. Date palms rise beside cultivated ground. Reeds gather where water slows. Birds move over shallows. Boats pass close enough to the bank for voices to carry between water and land. This is the older rhythm underneath Cleopatra's kingdom. The river had carried Egypt long before Alexander founded Alexandria. Long before Ptolemy took the crown. Long before Caesar crossed the Mediterranean. Long before Antony reached the Cydnus. Long before Octavian became Augustus. Kings had looked upon the Nile for thousands of years and believed their reign central to the order of the world. The river had outlived all of them. It would outlive Cleopatra too. Perhaps the annual flood had always contained this quiet lesson. Water comes, water leaves. The field disappears beneath it, then reappears. Seed becomes grain. Grain becomes bread. A season ends without ending the land. Human beings build monuments because we know we cannot remain. Stone is our argument with time, but even stone loses eventually. Water wears it, earth covers it, cities build over it, languages change around it, names become difficult to pronounce. Then sometimes a fragment returns, a coin pulled from soil, a papyrus preserved in dry sand, a face on a temple wall, a sentence copied by a writer who lived long after the person had died. And for a little while, someone is present again. Cleopatra's own world survives this way, not whole, never whole, but enough. Enough to stand beside the great harbor and know that royal ships once moved there. Enough to see her image at Dendera beside Caesarion. Enough to hold a coin and know that people used it while she was alive. Enough to read Plutarch carefully and hear, beneath his own age and purposes, the distant reputation of a queen known for her voice and intelligence. Enough to understand why Rome feared the political meaning of her children. Enough to know that an Egyptian kingdom reached its final Ptolemaic years under a woman who spent most of her adult life trying to keep it sovereign. And enough to know when we must stop pretending that we know more. There is peace in that uncertainty. We do not have to fill every dark room. We do not need the exact words spoken between Cleopatra and Caesar. We do not need to know whether Antony's final thoughts were romantic or political. We do not need to decide which hand wrote a particular word on every papyrus. We do not need to place a serpent in Cleopatra's chamber simply because generations of artists have done so. The unknown is part of history too. Perhaps it is one of history's most honest landscapes. The spaces where voices have vanished. The places where no document survives. The moments that belonged only to the people who lived them. Time keeps those for itself. The sun moves lower over Alexandria. Not the Alexandria of one particular recorded day, but the city as it can remain in imagination through all these years. Light warms pale stone. The harbor turns softer. Long shadows begin to stretch across quays and colonnades. Workers complete what must be completed before darkness. A vessel comes in slowly from the Mediterranean. Another waits to depart when conditions are right. Somewhere within the city, a lamp is being filled. Farther south, another lamp is being lit in a village beside the Nile. A priest closes one part of a temple, while another ritual continues deeper inside. Someone finishes a line of writing. Someone counts grain. Someone sleeps. The names of rulers change above them. Life continues below. Cleopatra is gone now. Caesarion is gone. Antony is gone. The Ptolemies no longer rule Egypt. Octavian soldiers occupy the city. And soon Roman administration will settle more completely into the spaces left behind. But no one living through these changes can yet see the centuries ahead. They do not know which buildings will fall. They do not know which books will vanish. They do not know which statues will be broken. They do not know that people thousands of years later will argue over Cleopatra's face, her ancestry, her loves, her death, and the place where she was buried. For them, there is only the present, warm stone beneath a hand, the taste of bread, a harbor breeze, a child growing tired, the faint sting of smoke from an oil lamp, the sound of water touching wood in darkness. That is where we should leave them, not frozen inside a historical ending, still moving, still eating, still working, still watching the river. Night settles gradually across the Mediterranean coast. The brilliance of the city diminishes into scattered points of flame. Rooms become dark beyond their lamps. The royal quarter, once alive with Ptolemaic ceremony, rests beneath another authority. Pharos continues to burn over the water. Its beacon does not ask which king rules the coast. It simply turns darkness into direction for ships still approaching from the sea. Beyond Alexandria, the Nile passes through the night. The surface catches whatever light the sky gives it. Fields lie quiet beside the banks. Reeds move when the wind reaches them. A bird shifts somewhere in the dark. A boat touches gently against its mooring. Farther inland, temples stand beneath the stars as they had before Cleopatra's birth. Her image remains carved among older gods. Stone Cleopatra still raises an offering. Stone Caesarion still stands beside her. They do not know that their dynasty has ended. In the stillness of relief and inscription, every gesture continues forever. And perhaps that is the closest history comes to allowing anyone to remain, not alive, not unchanged, but present enough that, centuries later, we can come quietly into their world and listen. The river continues north. The harbor continues breathing with the sea. Somewhere a final lamp grows smaller, and Egypt, no longer Cleopatra's kingdom, moves gently into another night.